PhilosophyTube published a video entitled African Philosophy and the Enlightenment. It's only about 11 minutes long, and you really should watch it before you finish watching this response. Please note that this video is not a takedown or rebuttal or even challenge to Ollie's original video. It's a critical response aimed at presenting an alternative, though not completely different, perspective. I'm going to point out some facts which I think contradict some of his conclusions, some facts which I think weaken some of his arguments, and some facts which I think not only support some of his arguments, but actually make them even stronger. There's a lot to cover, so I'll be releasing this response in 4 parts once a week.
But he also says that men and women should be equal in marriage, and that slavery is bad, which is a somewhat refreshing point of view when we compare him to some of his European Enlightenment counterparts, as we'll be seeing shortly.
This needs a lot of unpacking, so it's going to be the focus of this video. We'll start with the issue of marriage equality. Yacob loved a woman called Hirut, who was a slave belonging to his master, and asked his master to give her to him in marriage. His master said, quote, "Hereafter she is not my maidservant but yours," end quote. However, Yacob insisted, quote, "I do not wish her to be my maidservant but my wife. Husband and wife are equal in marriage. We should not call them master and maidservant, for they are one flesh and one life," end quote. Yacob then asked Hirut to be his wife. The fact that he sought her consent indicates that he really did see her as an equal, and we can expect that he treated her as one when they were married. Interestingly, Yacob does not say his view of marriage was derived from his rationalist approach to ethics, and from the way he justifies his position, it is clear he actually based his view on the Bible. He says, quote, "We should not call them master and maidservant, for they are one flesh and one life," end quote. This idea, in fact this very statement, is taken directly from the Bible book of Genesis, chapter 1 verse 23, in which husband and wife are described as one flesh. So Ollie is completely right to say Yacob believed men and women should be equal in marriage, and this additional information from Jacob's treatise strengthens that point. However, while it is true that Jacob's position is refreshing when compared to some of his Enlightenment counterparts, he was not a pioneer of this view of marriage. Some of the early Christian leaders had surprisingly progressive views on marriage, in contrast with the times in which they lived. John Chrysostom of the 4th century argued explicitly that a wife should not fear her husband, and said she should be like a free woman in the marriage, not a slave. He also said that a man should not raise his hand against his wife, nor insult, taunt, or deride her. Similarly, John Damascene, a Christian leader of the 8th century, said that husband and wife are, quote, "equal and without difference, neither prevails over the other," end quote. This is not to say that Yacob borrowed his views from either John Chrysostom or from John Damascene. It simply shows that Jacob's view of marriage was not only theologically motivated, being based on the Bible's teaching on marriage, but was directly in line with much earlier Christian commentary on the subject. Within Christianity, Jacob's views were not new. In Europe, medieval women from the 12th century onwards, when Christian legislation started being comprehensively systematized, replacing earlier local and Roman law, had a surprising amount of legal equality with their husbands. Scholars Judith Bennett, Ruth Karras, and Sarah McDougall note that marriages were not legal without the consent of both parties, and women had equal rights to divorce and separation, with divorce being granted on grounds of cruelty, adultery, or lack of consent. It's also very important to recognize the lengthy tradition of historical European feminist thought which drew strength from this medieval legislation. Long before Yacob, Europe had been developing an early feminist movement called Proto Feminism by historians, which would have a long-lasting and widespread impact on equality within Christian Europe. It's important to remember that many women writers were involved in this movement, including Cristina de Pizan, 1405, Laura Cereta, 1488, Tulia d'Aragona, 1547, Jane Anger, 1589, Moderata Fonte, 1600, Constantia Munda, 1617, Rachel Spate, 1617, Esther Sonam, 1617, and Marie de Gournay, 1622. Proto-feminist men included Giovanni Boccaccio, 1360, Ludovico Aristo, 1516, Henricus Cornelius Agrippa, 1529, Thomas Eliot, 1545, and Richard Ferrers, 1622. So once again we see that Jacob's views on marriage, though quite enlightened, were not revolutionary when compared with thinkers in Europe who had held such views for centuries and who had developed them far more systematically than Jacob. However, Jacob's views on marriage certainly would have been absolutely revolutionary in 17th century Ethiopia, especially since the traditional culture was highly patriarchal. Historically, Ethiopian culture permitted men to kidnap women and marry them against their will, beat their wives, and force them to have sex. Female genital mutilation, child marriage, and sex trafficking are still prominent features of traditional Ethiopian culture. Jacob's Christian view of marriage was therefore in strong contrast to the culture of his own nation, and in fact it's rather disturbing to think that Jacob's views, nearly 400 years ago, are still more progressive than mainstream Ethiopian culture in 2019. Nevertheless, Jacob's enlightened view of women and marriage had its limits. In one section of his work, he describes the weakness of religious faith which isn't based on truth, and explains that when the individual discovers their faith has been based on falsehoods, it will lead them to abandon their religious beliefs. To illustrate this situation, he uses the metaphor of a man who discovers his child is illegitimate due to his wife's adultery. Jacob says that if the man made this discovery, quote, he would be sad and would send her out with her child, end quote. So Jacob thinks that adultery is legitimate grounds for a man divorcing his wife and abandoning both his wife and child, who are forced to leave his house. This is not a particularly enlightened attitude, and it might disappoint us to realize that Jacob held such a harsh view. But we must remember that in his time and place, he truly was ahead of his peers. He doesn't need to have been ahead of European thought in order to be admirable. Philosopher Tewodros Kiros says, quote, for 17th century Ethiopia, Zera Yacob's views on gender equality were truly enlightened and extremely progressive, end quote. Now let's take a look at his attitude to slavery. It's interesting that when Jacob is cited on the subject of slavery, his actual words are rarely quoted. One source says that his philosophical investigation led him to, quote, criticize slavery, end quote, but does not actually quote his words. Another source says Jacob, quote, condemned slavery, end quote, and reproduces Jacob's statement, quote, because men came into the world equal, end quote. A third source says Jacob, quote, argues against the idea that one can go and buy a man as if he were an animal, end quote. A fourth source provides more of Jacob's actual words, saying Jacob wrote, quote, it is stated in the text that buying and selling human beings like an animal is right, end quote. But then marks an ellipsis where some of Jacob's words are being omitted, before continuing to quote Jacob's condemnation of the sale of human beings as animals. In all of these citations of Jacob, something is clearly being missed out. It's particularly obvious in the fourth citation. Now, before I go any further, I'm going to say outright that there is no conspiracy here to make Jacob appear more modern or humanitarian than he was. Jacob really did oppose slavery. However, he did it in a particular context, and for whatever reason, that context is typically not mentioned when his views on slavery are cited. In some cases, as in the fourth citation I provided, it is actually being deliberately omitted. Let's look at what Jacob actually wrote in the scholarly English translation of his work by Claude Summer. What Jacob wrote in this passage was, quote, likewise the Mohammedans said that it is right to go and buy a man as if he were an animal. But with our intelligence, we understand that this Mohammedan law cannot come from the Creator of man, who made us equal, like brothers, so that we call our Creator our Father, end quote. Well, so what? How does this contribute to a better understanding of what Jacob thought about slavery? Professor Chike Jeffers explains. He says, quote, it is furthermore noteworthy that, when he criticizes slavery, Zera Yacob is not talking about the transatlantic slave trade and the treatment of Africans by Europeans, but rather his understanding of the precepts of Islam, end quote. Dr. Teshome Ebara likewise states explicitly, quote, Zera Yacob also refused Muhammad's idea of slavery, end quote. In fact, living in Ethiopia in the 17th century, it is entirely possible that Yacob might not have even heard of the transatlantic slave trade, which operated on the western coast of Africa, the opposite side to Ethiopia, while the Arab slave trade operated on the eastern coast. Yacob clearly demonstrates awareness of the Arab slave trade, which he attributes specifically to Muslims. It's unclear to me why so many scholars omit any reference to the fact that Yacob was objecting specifically to the slave trade practiced by Muslim Arabs, and objecting in particular to the Muslim justification of slavery by appeal to the Quran. I don't think that quoting Yacob's words about Muslim attitudes to slavery makes it look like he was only objecting to the Arab slave trade, as if he wouldn't have objected to the transatlantic slave trade. If Yacob had heard of the transatlantic slave trade, he would undoubtedly have disapproved of it also, for the same reasons, and would very likely have written about it. Ollie was right to say that Yacob objected to slavery. This is proved by Yacob's egalitarian treatment of his wife Hirut, who was a slave when he asked her to marry him. This is an important fact which strengthens Ollie's point. More interesting is the question of why Yacob cites the Muslim-Arab slave trade while omitting any reference to the traditional Ethiopian slave trade. In fact, on the east coast of Africa, the Ethiopian Empire was the largest and most influential slave trader. Yacob must have been aware of this, especially since he refers explicitly to the fact that Hirut, the woman he married, was the slave of his own master. However, I haven't found this point discussed in the scholarly literature, and I don't feel confident offering an opinion on this subject myself. Ollie is right to comment that Yacob's view on slavery is refreshingly different to the views of some Enlightenment figures, such as John Locke, who owned shares in slavery, profited from the industry, and believed in the moral right of more powerful or supposedly advanced people to enslave others. Some other Enlightenment philosophers also held this view, such as David Hume, James Long, Immanuel Kant, and François-Marie Arouet Voltaire. However, other Enlightenment philosophers opposed slavery, such as Jean-Jacques Rousseau, Denis Diderot, Thomas Paine, and the extravagantly named Charles-Louis de Secondat Baron de la Brère de Montesquieu. Yacob's Bible-based objection to slavery was certainly extraordinary in his time and place, given Ethiopia's position as a major slave-trading power. However, what sets him apart from other protesters against slavery is his lack of broader action against the slave trade. Apart from his egalitarian treatment of Hirut, the slave woman he married, there is no evidence that he made any effort to change the status of slaves in Ethiopia or agitate for their liberation. This aligns him more with Enlightenment philosophers such as Thomas Jefferson, who believed slavery was against nature and who repeatedly spoke out against slavery, but who did virtually nothing to end it, owned around 600 slaves, and freed only 7 of them. Yacob's theological justification for his opposition to slavery is clear from the fact that he tells us explicitly that he is basing his view on his belief that God, the Creator, made all people like brothers, so that they call God their Father. This terminology is taken straight from the Bible, where we also find opposition to slavery. In the New Testament of the Christian Bible, in the book of 1 Timothy chapter 1 verse 10, the Apostle Paul condemns people he calls enslavers, saying that they cannot enter the kingdom of God. The Greek word he uses is andropodistes, which literally means people who kidnap others as slaves, or sell people as slaves, or even buy people as slaves. Many early Christians, though probably not the majority, acted on this by going to slave markets, buying slaves, and setting them free. Christian leader Gregory of Nyssa wrote a condemnation of the institution of slavery. Archbishop John Chrysostom condemned slavery, and especially the sexual exploitation of slaves, and told his church members to buy slaves, set them free, and teach them a trade so they could support themselves. Bishop Acacius of Amida collected his church's silver and gold items and sold them to raise money to buy and free slaves. Christian writers record and praise the actions of other Christians who liberated slaves by buying them and setting them free. This is even more remarkable given the fact that other Christians saw no reason to free their slaves. So while Yacob's view on slavery is very humane, in comparison with some Enlightenment philosophers, It's puzzling that he didn't openly criticize the slave trade in his own nation, nor take any active steps to combat slavery or encourage others to do so. This sets him apart from earlier abolitionists in Europe and the Americas, such as the Christian sect called the Quakers, who started protesting slavery in 1657 and were gradually successful in overturning slavery laws in North America. Even earlier people and groups who fought actively against slavery and serfdom were the English Levellers, 1642 to 1651, the Catholic priest Bartolome de las Casas, 1484 to 1566, the German peasant leader Sebastian Lotze, born in 1490, date of death uncertain, and the Englishman John Ball, 1338 to 1381. Again, it must be remembered that none of this detracts from the value of Yacob's views or the importance of the fact that he arrived at his position independently. It doesn't matter that he didn't actually reach his conclusions before anyone else, and even his lack of direct action against slavery doesn't detract from his opposition to it. We should appreciate Yacob for what he was and what he did, rather than for what he didn't do, or for whether he had certain ideas before anyone else. Although the humanitarian and rationalist views he held had already been well developed in Europe, in 17th century Ethiopia, Yacob was a one-man enlightenment.